Rome. A city that began with a handful of hills along the banks of the Tiber eventually grew into the most powerful civilization of the ancient world. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire stretched from the British Isles to the deserts of Arabia, from the Atlantic Ocean to Mesopotamia. More than 60 million people, nearly a fifth of humanity at the time, lived under its laws, its roads, and its legions. What the Romans created seemed solid and unshakable. Their roads crossed entire continents. Their cities were filled with aqueducts, forums, bathhouses, and amphitheaters. Their army was considered the best in the world, and their laws a model of order. The empire offered its peoples what the Romans themselves called Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was a 2-century period of relative stability that began under Augustus and ended under Marcus Aurelius. For many generations, Rome became not just a state, but the very idea of civilization. To most, it felt impossible that such a power could collapse. A system so vast seemed simply too big to fall. Yet within this magnificent structure, cracks were already forming. The economy relied on constant expansion. Slavery, the foundation of Roman production, was gradually becoming less efficient. The enormous distances made governing increasingly difficult. And the legions, once disciplined and loyal, were becoming tools in political struggles. During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the so-called 5 good emperors, the empire's borders felt serious pressure for the first time in decades. Germanic tribes pushed from the north, and in the east a new power was rising, the Persian Sasanian Empire. Rome was forced to defend itself more often and expand less. Even then, no one could truly imagine that Rome might one day disappear. A power that had destroyed Carthage, conquered Greece, and subdued half the known world seemed untouchable. But in history, decline rarely begins with a dramatic fall. It begins with small, almost invisible changes, with decisions that seem reasonable at the time, with situations that appear temporary. And so Rome entered a path that, 3 centuries later, would lead to its downfall. To understand why an empire that seemed eternal eventually collapsed, we must first see the moment when its last golden age ended. That moment came with the death of Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher, a ruler, and a man who maintained Rome's fragile balance for nearly 20 years. After him begins a new era in Rome's story, one in which internal weakness and external pressure intertwine so deeply that not even great reforms could stop the coming catastrophe. And this is where the true story of the fall of the Roman Empire begins. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD marked a symbolic turning point. With his passing, Rome lost not only its last philosopher on the throne, but also the rare figure who held together the fragile balance of a vast empire. Immediately after him came his son, Commodus, a ruler whom many contemporaries saw as the beginning of Rome's downfall. Commodus was the complete opposite of his father. While Marcus Aurelius spent nights writing philosophical reflections, his son preferred the gladiatorial arena and theatrical performances. He withdrew from state affairs almost entirely, handing power to favorites, unreliable officials, and court intrigants. During his 12-year reign, the empire became a shadow of what it once was, still grand and impressive, but increasingly weak, vulnerable, and disconnected from its former principles. The assassination of Commodus on the last day of the year 192 did not bring stability. Instead, it ignited the empire like a spark on dry grass. After his death began a period known today as the Year of the 5 Emperors. Legions, the Praetorian Guard, and provincial elites put forward their own candidates, each claiming the throne by force. When Septimius Severus took power in 193 AD, it seemed that order had finally been restored, at least partially. He was a capable general and managed to prevent the empire from immediate collapse. But the cost of his policies became another crack in Rome's foundation. Severus dramatically increased the pay of legionaries and gave the army nearly unlimited influence. He even uttered a phrase that would later be seen as prophetic: "Enrich the soldiers and despise all others." This single sentence perfectly described his approach. The army became the true source of power rather than a tool of the state, and in the future this would prove disastrous. After Severus, the throne passed by inheritance, first to Caracalla, then to Elagabalus, then to Alexander Severus. But none of them were able to stop the approaching storm. The empire was sinking deeper into instability. The economy was under enormous strain. The denarius, Rome's primary currency, rapidly lost value because emperors reduced the silver content in the coin to finance the army and the state apparatus. Inflation became a constant reality. Trade declined, prices rose, and taxes increased. Meanwhile, pressure grew along the borders. The Alemanni, Goths, Franks, and other northern tribes pushed hard from beyond the Rhine and Danube. In the east, the Persian Sasanian Empire gained strength and launched powerful offensives. Provincial unrest and separatist movements became more frequent. These processes were slowly but inevitably weakening the imperial structure. Rome was still vast and impressive on the surface, but inside it had become an aging organism, worn down by war, unreliable officials, and economic decay. After the year 235, the situation would deteriorate dramatically in what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, the most dangerous period in all of Roman history. But to understand that crisis fully, one must first see the final years before the storm, years in which Rome still stood, but no longer had the strength to return to its former stability. The era of the Principate, a system in which emperors masked their absolute power behind the facade of being first among equals, was ending. A new age was beginning, one dominated by military dictatorship, constant usurpations, and unending turmoil. This was not merely a time of change, it was the beginning of the road that would lead to the deepest crisis the empire had ever faced, a crisis that nearly destroyed Rome long before its final fall in 476 AD. After the year 235 AD, the Roman Empire entered a period historians would later call the crisis of the 3rd century. It was one of the most difficult and dangerous moments in Rome's entire history, a time when the very existence of the state was at risk. The crisis began with the assassination of Emperor Alexander Severus, the last ruler of the Severan dynasty. After his death, power fell into the hands of military commanders supported by their own troops. The empire no longer had a stable way to transfer authority. Any legion could promote its own candidate, and legions often fought one another. In just a few decades, more than 20 emperors rose and fell, many losing their lives in battles for the throne. Military instability made the borders extremely vulnerable. From the north, Germanic peoples, Goths, Franks, and Alemanni, launched frequent raids. They destroyed cities, disrupted trade routes, and threatened key provinces. In the east, the Persian Sasanian Empire grew stronger. Under Shapur-Vafur, the Persians achieved several major victories. They invaded Syria, plundered Antioch, and even captured Emperor Valerian alive. The only time in history a Roman emperor became a prisoner of a foreign ruler. At the same time, internal conditions were deteriorating. The economy suffered under constant military expenses. Roman coins lost value as the silver content decreased, causing inflation and rising prices. Trade routes were unsafe, provincial income fell, and shortages of food became more common. The crisis was worsened by outbreaks of disease. One of them, known today as the Plague of Cyprian, spread across vast regions. It took thousands of lives daily, weakened legions, reduced the workforce, and caused severe demographic decline. Cities emptied, and agriculture struggled to function. Amid the chaos, some regions attempted to break away from Rome. In the west emerged the Gallic Empire, which included parts of Gaul, Britain, and Spain. In the east, the Palmyrene state took shape, and under Queen Zenobia, it controlled Syria, Egypt, and Arabia. The Roman world had effectively split into 3 major parts, and many believed it would never be united again. Yet even during these dark years, there were leaders determined to preserve the empire. One of the most capable was Aurelian, a decisive and skilled ruler. He managed to reclaim both the Gallic Empire and Palmyra, restoring unity to the fractured territories. Though his reign was brief, it became a rare moment of stability. By the middle of the 3rd century, however, Rome had changed dramatically. The empire had endured economic collapse, constant invasions, territorial fragmentation, epidemics, and decades of internal conflict. It survived, but emerged much weaker than before. And although the crisis eventually eased, it left deep wounds that would play a crucial role in the eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire. After decades of chaos, invasions, epidemics, and constant struggles for power, the Roman Empire reached a point where survival itself was uncertain. But toward the end of the 3rd century, a remarkable leader emerged, a man whose reforms would reshape Rome more than any emperor since Augustus. His name was Diocletian. Diocletian came to power in 284 AD, and from the very beginning he understood that the old system could no longer sustain such a vast empire. The crisis of the 3rd century had revealed a painful truth. Rome was simply too large, too diverse, and too unstable to be ruled effectively by one person from a single center. To fix this, Diocletian introduced one of the most ambitious political reforms in Roman history, the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Under this system, the empire was divided into 2 main halves, each with its own senior emperor, called Augustus, and a junior emperor, called Caesar. This structure allowed faster responses to military threats and created a clearer plan for succession. For a time, it worked. Frontiers became more secure, and internal struggles decreased. Diocletian also introduced a number of economic and administrative reforms. He reorganized provinces, strengthened local administration, and attempted to control inflation with his famous edict on maximum prices, a set of fixed limits on the cost of goods and services. Although the edict did not stop rising prices, it demonstrated how deeply the emperor was trying to stabilize daily life. Another significant policy was the restructuring of the army. Diocletian increased the number of soldiers and improved the defensive network along the borders. Instead of focusing on expansion, Rome now concentrated on protecting what it already had. This shift marked the beginning of a new strategic era. Yet Diocletian's reforms were not only administrative. He also played a major role in shaping the empire's religious policy, supporting traditional Roman beliefs and attempting to restore unity through them. But after 20 years of strenuous rule, he did something almost unheard of. He voluntarily abdicated the throne in 305 AD and retired to live the rest of his life away from politics. After Diocletian, power struggles resumed, but one figure eventually rose above all others: Constantine the Great. By 312 AD, Constantine had defeated his rivals and became the dominant emperor in the western part of the empire. His reign would transform Rome in ways that would shape European history for centuries. One of Constantine's most defining decisions was his support for Christianity. With the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, he granted Christians full freedom of worship, ending the long period of religious restrictions. This move not only changed the spiritual landscape of the empire, but also created a new source of unity among its peoples. Constantine also introduced important military and administrative reforms. He strengthened the frontier defenses, reorganized the mobile field armies, and continued Diocletian's efforts to stabilize the economy. But his most symbolic act was the founding of a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of ancient Byzantium. This city, strategically located between Europe and Asia, would later become the center of the Eastern Roman Empire for more than 1,000 years. By the mid-4th century, the Roman world looked very different from what it had been during the crisis. The empire was more centralized, more structured, and at least temporarily more stable. But the division between East and West, strengthened by Diocletian and solidified by Constantine, would eventually become permanent. And while the Eastern Empire would survive and prosper, the Western half was still moving toward collapse. After the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, the Roman Empire entered a new era. For a time, the state seemed more stable and organized, but beneath the surface, deeper problems were already forming, problems that would eventually tear the Western Empire apart. The 4th century witnessed enormous movements of peoples across Europe. This period, known as the Great Migration, brought new pressures to Rome's borders. Germanic tribes such as the Goths, Vandals, and Burgundians were pushed westward by forces even stronger than themselves. Most notably the Huns, a nomadic confederation moving from the Eurasian steppes. As these groups approached Roman territory, the empire struggled to manage the sudden influx of displaced populations. Rome attempted to integrate many of these peoples as federati, allied groups who were allowed to settle inside the empire in exchange for service in the Roman armies. In theory, this system offered Rome fresh soldiers and loyal communities. In practice, it became a source of instability. The empire no longer had the resources to fully control or support these groups, and misunderstandings often turned into conflict. One of the most decisive moments came in 376 AD, when tens of thousands of Goths sought refuge inside Roman lands to escape the Huns. Poor treatment, corruption among local administrators, and shortages of food soon led to open revolt. In 378 AD, the Goths defeated the Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople, where Emperor Valens was killed. This battle revealed a painful truth. The Western Empire no longer possessed the military strength it once had. Yet Rome still produced capable leaders who tried to resist decline. One of them was Stilicho, a skilled general of mixed Roman and Vandal origin. Serving as guardian and commander under Emperor Honorius, Stilicho defended the empire against multiple invasions. He managed to hold the West together during some of its most fragile years, but political rivals viewed his influence with suspicion. In 408 AD, Stilicho was executed, and with his death the Western Empire lost one of its last great defenders. Shortly afterward, the Visigoths under their king Alaric marched into Italy. Without Stilicho's leadership, Rome was unable to stop them. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The city of Rome was sacked for the first time in nearly 800 years. Though the destruction was limited compared to later events, the psychological impact was enormous. To the ancient world, Rome was the center of civilization. Its fall shook the empire's confidence and signaled that the West was weakening rapidly. Another towering figure of this era was Flavius Aetius, often called the last true Roman. Aetius was an exceptional diplomat and military leader, known for his ability to negotiate with barbarian groups and even use them as allies. His most famous achievement came in 451 AD at the Battle of the Catalaunian Fields, where he halted the advance of Attila the Hun. The battle did not destroy the Huns, but it prevented them from dominating Western Europe. Despite these temporary successes, the Western Empire continued to crumble. Economic weakness, shrinking populations, and continuous warfare drained its resources. Many provinces no longer had the manpower to support the army or pay taxes. The imperial government relied increasingly on barbarian generals, whose loyalty was tied more to personal reward than to Rome itself. By the mid-5th century, large regions such as Gaul, Spain, and North Africa were effectively outside Roman control. The West still had emperors, but their authority was mostly symbolic. Real power often rested in the hands of military commanders who acted independently. The stage was now set for the final chapter of the Western Roman Empire. A world where the emperor had little control, armies were dominated by foreign troops, and the last remnants of Roman authority continued to fade year by year. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire had become a shadow of its former self. Large provinces were lost, armies were filled with foreign troops, and real political authority had shifted away from the emperors. What remained of Roman power was now concentrated in Italy, and even there it was unstable and fragile. One of the most influential figures of this late period was Ricimer, a powerful military leader of Germanic origin. Although he never took the imperial title, Ricimer effectively controlled the government by placing puppet emperors on the throne. Over a decade, he removed or replaced several rulers, deepening the political fragmentation of the West. Under his dominance, emperors had little independence, and authority became even more symbolic. As internal power struggles continued, the empire faced growing pressure from outside. The Vandals, already settled in North Africa, launched naval raids along the Mediterranean coast. In 455 AD, they captured and plundered Rome, causing further shock across the ancient world. Meanwhile, in Gaul and Spain, new barbarian kingdoms emerged, leaving Italy increasingly isolated. The economic foundation of the West weakened dramatically. North Africa, once the empire's main source of grain and revenue, was lost. Without this wealth, the government struggled to maintain the army and pay its remaining troops. Many soldiers turned their loyalty toward local commanders rather than the distant emperor in Ravenna, the western capital. Amid this decline rose Orestes, a Roman general who seized control of the government in 475 AD. Instead of taking the throne himself, he placed his teenage son on it, a boy named Romulus, later known as Romulus Augustulus. The name was symbolic. Romulus was the legendary founder of Rome and Augustus its first emperor. But the symbolism could not hide the reality. The Western Empire had little left to rule. Only a year later, a new power emerged, Odoacer, the leader of a federation of Germanic soldiers who had served under the Roman command. These troops demanded land and recognition, and when Orestes refused, they rebelled. Odoacer's forces captured and executed Orestes, then marched on Ravenna. In 476 AD, Odoacer forced Romulus Augustulus to abdicate. The young emperor was spared and sent into comfortable exile, but with his removal, the Western Roman Empire effectively came to an end. Odoacer did not claim the imperial title. Instead, he declared himself ruler of Italy and sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, acknowledging him as the only Roman emperor. To many historians, this moment, the abdication of Romulus Augustulus in 476, marks the official end of the Western Roman Empire. But the collapse was not a sudden event. It was the culmination of centuries of internal weakness, external pressure, economic decline, and political fragmentation. The Eastern Roman Empire, known later as the Byzantine Empire, survived these crises. It had stronger urban centers, a more stable economy, and better defenses. Constantinople, protected by massive walls and its strategic location, became the heart of a state that would endure for nearly another 1,000 years. For the West, however, the ancient order was gone. In its place rose new kingdoms led by the Goths, Vandals, Franks, and others. They governed according to their own traditions, but continued to adopt Roman laws, culture, and administration. Rome's political structure collapsed, but its legacy remained, shaping Europe long after the empire itself had fallen. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD was not a single event, nor the result of one invasion or one crisis. It was a long, complex process shaped by many forces working together over centuries. To understand why the eternal empire collapsed, we must look at the deeper patterns that weakened it from within and exposed it to dangers from the outside. One of the central reasons was the gradual decline of Rome's economic strength. In earlier centuries, the empire thrived on trade, agriculture, and the wealth of its provinces. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, repeated wars, loss of territory, and disruptions in trade routes had reduced its ability to sustain large armies and maintain infrastructure. The loss of North Africa, once a major supplier of food and revenue, left the West especially vulnerable. Without stable income, the government struggled to support its forces and keep the state functioning. Another key factor was constant pressure on the borders. For generations, the Roman frontier along the Rhine and Danube had served as a buffer, but during the Great Migration, entire nations moved toward Roman lands, driven by instability and by the expansion of the Huns. Instead of facing isolated raids, Rome now confronted large, organized groups seeking permanent settlement. Some were accepted as federated allies, while others pushed their way in through force. The empire no longer had the strength or cohesion to manage this influx. Internal fragmentation also played a major role. The political system that once ensured unity slowly turned into a struggle for influence among powerful generals and regional leaders. In the West, emperors became increasingly dependent on commanders who had their own tribes, allies, and interests. This imbalance of authority made it difficult for the government to act decisively or rebuild stability. Changes in the structure of the army further weakened the empire. Over time, fewer soldiers came from traditional Roman communities, and more were recruited from various allied groups. While many of these recruits served loyally, the shift made the army less unified and more influenced by local leaders. Rival commanders could rise to power quickly. shaping policy according to their own goals rather than those of the emperor. Cultural and administrative shifts also played their part. The move of the imperial center to Constantinople created a strong Eastern Empire, but it left the West with fewer resources, fewer major cities, and a weaker economic foundation. The East had the advantage of rich trade routes and better defensive positions, while the West faced constant strain from all directions. Ultimately, Rome fell because too many challenges struck at once: economic decline, demographic losses, external pressures, and internal divisions. No single reform, no single general, and no single victory could reverse all these forces. The Western Empire slowly transformed into a collection of regional powers, each following its own path. Yet the end of the empire was not the end of Rome itself. Roman law, language, architecture, and ideas survived through the kingdoms that replaced it. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, endured for nearly 1,000 more years, preserving much of Rome's legacy and carrying it into the medieval world. The fall of Rome reminds us that even the greatest civilizations are not immune to time, change, and pressure. But it also shows that ideas can endure long after empires fade. Rome fell, yet in many ways, it never truly disappeared. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support truly matters and helps us create more historical content. Feel free to explore our other videos as well. You will find many more fascinating stories about the great events and people of the past. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the next episode.